black teen, dragged off flight unfairly. Then he calls his father, who owns the airline. Isaiah Washington never imagined his return flight from a simple weekend getaway could turn into a headline-making nightmare. As a confident, bright-eyed black teenager, he boarded the plane at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, thinking only of reuniting with his family. But in a shocking turn of events, he found himself forcibly pulled from his seat, his pleas for reason ignored by airline staff who cared more about public image than truth. Little did they know Isaiah was not just any passenger. With one phone call to his father, a powerful figure with deep ties to Delta Airlines, Isaiah unknowingly ignited a chain reaction that would bring justice and karma full circle. Isaiah Washington felt a surge of excitement as he stepped into the bustling terminal of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. The terminal thrummed with the steady rhythm of rolling suitcases, nervous travelers tapping their feet, and families reuniting or saying farewell. It wasn't Isaiah's first time flying, but there was always something exhilarating about it, the sense of going somewhere new or coming home changed and wiser. At 17 years old, he was used to traveling, thanks to his father's involvement with Delta Airlines. Most people assumed that meant Isaiah always flew first class or had a red carpet experience. But Isaiah, a humble soul who believed in forging his own path, insisted on traveling like any other passenger when he could. He wore a simple black hoodie and dark jeans. In his ears, he had a pair of wireless earbuds, playing his favorite music, hip-hop, interspersed with orchestral scores. He had an eclectic taste. As he made his way to Gate Byzantine, he felt a mix of excitement and slight nervousness. He was returning from a small trip to see friends in Florida, and although it was only a brief weekend getaway, it had been enough time to recharge and enjoy himself. The boarding process began smoothly. He scanned his mobile boarding pass, smiled politely at the gate agent, and found his seat in the main cabin. The airplane hummed with an undercurrent of chatter, passengers storing their luggage, flight attendants guiding people to seats, overhead compartments slamming shut. Isaiah settled by the window, placing his backpack carefully under the seat in front of him. He adjusted the overhead air vent and gazed outside at the Atlanta skyline. Little did he know that this ordinary day would soon spiral into chaos. Moments after settling in, Isaiah noticed a tense ripple through the cabin. An older woman seated across the aisle, who had eyed him suspiciously from the moment he boarded, was speaking in hushed, urgent tones to a flight attendant. Isaiah couldn't catch the full conversation, but he picked up fragments like "feels unsafe" and "he's acting strange." Confusion whirled through his mind. He was just sitting there, minding his own business. What could this possibly be about? He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was probably nothing. But the tension in the air was palpable, and soon a different flight attendant approached. A tall man with a serious expression, he stood in the aisle next to Isaiah's seat, blocking the light from the overhead lamps. He leaned in, voice low, and asked, "Is everything all right here?" Isaiah blinked in confusion. "Yes, of course. Is there a problem?" Isaiah asked, pausing his music. The attendant cleared his throat. "We received a complaint from a passenger that you might be disruptive." He frowned, as if even he didn't believe the words coming out of his mouth. "Are you traveling alone?" Isaiah nodded, annoyance and apprehension growing. "I'm just returning from a weekend trip. I haven't done anything. Why would there be a complaint?" The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably. "I understand. Let me speak with the other passenger." Before the attendant could leave, the older woman piped up, glaring in Isaiah's direction. He was acting very suspicious before boarding. "I don't know. I just feel something is off about him," she insisted. Her voice shook slightly, but there was a tinge of accusation that cut like a knife. Isaiah clenched his fists in his lap. Though he tried to remain calm, he could sense the eyes of other passengers on him. He noticed a mother shielding her child's gaze, a businessman frowning in curiosity, and a couple whispering to each other. A prickle of dread crawled up Isaiah's spine. He had done nothing wrong. He was just a teenager trying to get home. The flight attendant stepped away to consult with another cabin crew member. Isaiah felt the mood shift all around him. Even though no one had said it openly, he recognized this scenario far too well. People saw a young black man in a hoodie traveling alone, and they assumed the worst. Racial profiling was nothing new to Isaiah. He'd read about it, heard stories from older relatives, and witnessed people looking at him with fear in shopping malls. But he had never expected something so blatant, so immediate, especially right here on a plane affiliated with the airline his father had spent much of his life building. The seconds ticked by, each feeling more oppressive than the last. He considered texting his father, but he hesitated. He wanted to handle this on his own if possible. He didn't like to depend on his father's status to solve every problem. His father had raised him to stand on his own feet, to fight injustice with dignity. But the knot in Isaiah's stomach told him this situation might demand more than simply explaining himself calmly. A female flight attendant returned with the same tall man, both looking uneasy. "Sir, we're going to ask you a few questions," she said, her tone professional yet firm. "Could you please step into the aisle?" Isaiah felt his stomach drop. He noticed the curious, judging faces of nearby passengers. With a slow breath to steady himself, Isaiah stood up, stepping out into the narrow aisle. He stood a couple of inches shorter than the male flight attendant, but Isaiah held his head high. "Yes?" he said, forcing himself to stay respectful. "What can I do for you? Are you carrying anything dangerous on your person or in your bag?" the male attendant asked stiffly. "We received a report that you might pose a threat to the flight." Isaiah's heart thudded in his chest. "No, sir, I'm not. I went through TSA security just like everyone else." He turned, gesturing to his backpack. "You can check my bag if you like. It's just clothes and a tablet." The attendants exchanged glances. They had no real evidence to suspect him of anything. Yet the older woman's panicked whispers seemed to overshadow common sense. Isaiah saw the difficulty in their eyes. They didn't want to be the cause of a false accusation, but they also felt pressured by the passenger's complaint. In an era of heightened anxieties, many staff members would rather err on the side of caution, no matter whose rights they trampled in the process. Isaiah felt the sweat bead on his temple as the attendants decided whether or not to search him. He couldn't believe how quickly everything had escalated. He considered once again making that call to his father, but the flight wasn't even fully boarded yet. Maybe reason would prevail, he told himself. He cooperated, removing his backpack from beneath the seat. "Here," Isaiah said, unzipping his bag. "I have nothing to hide." Passengers craned their necks to look. The older woman watched from her seat, hands clasped tensely. The flight attendants rifled through a couple of T-shirts, an extra pair of jeans, a paperback novel Isaiah had been reading, some headphones, and his tablet. Nothing was suspicious. Despite this, the female flight attendant looked less than satisfied. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaky. "Just, please remain seated and keep calm. We'll be monitoring the situation." Isaiah started to voice a protest, but thought better of it. This was humiliating. He squeezed back into his seat and exhaled slowly, hoping that would be the end of it. But the older woman across the aisle wouldn't let it go. She muttered loudly to the passenger beside her, and her anxious, accusatory tone infected the rest of the cabin. Another passenger, a middle-aged man in business attire, chimed in, "I saw him pacing around near the restrooms earlier. It was suspicious." Isaiah shook his head in disbelief. He had been waiting in line to use the restroom, not pacing maliciously. Yet the narrative was taking shape without him. The flight attendants had done their cursory check, but the growing unrest among a few passengers was pushing them to take more drastic measures. Before the plane could push back, a uniformed officer suddenly boarded. He walked straight to Isaiah's row, flanked by the two flight attendants. The officer's posture was commanding, and his face was devoid of emotion. "We've received multiple reports that you might be causing a disturbance or threat," the officer said, voice low and deliberate, tension coiled in Isaiah's chest. "I'm not causing a disturbance," he insisted, voice shaking with a mix of frustration and fear. "I haven't done anything. It didn't matter." The officer's hand hovered near his baton as though expecting violence. Without explaining further, the officer said, "I'm going to need you to deplane, son." At that moment, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Isaiah could feel the collective gaze of every passenger. Some looked relieved that the threat might be removed. Others looked appalled by the blatant unfairness. Isaiah's heart pounded. He opened his mouth to defend himself more forcefully, but the officer gave him no choice. He reached down, grabbed Isaiah's arm, and started pulling him out of his seat. A surge of pain shot through Isaiah's shoulder as he resisted the urge to fight back. He knew that one aggressive move could escalate things to a dangerous level. "Stop!" Isaiah cried out, wincing in humiliation as he was manhandled. "I'll go on my own. You don't have to drag me." But it was too late. The officer had locked onto him, and the flight attendants were standing by, letting it happen. The older woman across the aisle stared, wide-eyed but oddly triumphant, as if her worst fears were being confirmed. Camera phones emerged in the hands of other passengers, capturing the spectacle of a young black teen being violently removed from an airplane seat for no justifiable reason. In a desperate moment, Isaiah's composure broke. "I want to call my father," he said through gritted teeth. But he was cut off by the officer's gruff command. "No talking, we're sorting this out. Let's go." Isaiah stumbled down the aisle, the officer's grip unrelenting. Frustration and shame burned in Isaiah's throat as he tried to maintain some shred of dignity. He forced himself to remain quiet until they were off the plane and onto the jet bridge. Once they cleared the aircraft door, the officer released his hold, and Isaiah's backpack slipped from his shoulder, landing on the floor with a thud. Breathing heavily, Isaiah looked at the officer, whose expression was stony. "Why are you doing this?" Isaiah demanded, his voice cracking. "I passed every security check. I wasn't causing any trouble. There's no reason to treat me like a criminal." The officer's eyes flickered, perhaps a hint of uncertainty crossing his features, but he simply said, "We're responding to complaints, son. You need to calm down." Isaiah felt tears of rage threaten to spill over. People were milling about at the gate, watching the scene with curiosity and, in some cases, concern. The flight attendants hovered behind the officer, exchanging glances that betrayed their discomfort. It was as if none of them knew exactly what to do next. With trembling hands, Isaiah dug into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I want to make a call," he repeated, more calmly now. "Is that allowed, or are you going to tackle me for using my phone too?" The officer's lips pressed into a thin line. After a long pause, he nodded curtly. "Fine. Make it quick." Isaiah stepped back, finding a pillar near the gate to lean against. His mind churned, heavy with anger and betrayal, but he knew exactly whom he needed to call. He scrolled through his contacts and pressed call on Dad. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Isaiah? Aren't you supposed to be in the air? Is everything all right?" Isaiah's voice quivered as he struggled to stay composed. "I got dragged off the plane, Dad. Accused of, I don't even know what. People claimed I was suspicious, and the flight attendants believed them." A dangerous edge crept into his father's voice. "Dragged off? Are you hurt?" "I'm okay," Isaiah said, though he clutched his bruised shoulder. "I'm just humiliated. They're refusing to let me board. They said I'm a threat, or something." He paused, feeling tears welling in his eyes. He quickly wiped them away. "What can I do?" There was a brief silence. Then his father spoke, his tone measured but simmering with anger. "Where exactly are you?" "Gate B17, 1717. "Yes," Isaiah answered quietly, glancing at the sign overhead. "Stay put," his father replied. "I'll make some calls. Then we'll see who's making threats. Don't let them move you anywhere else." Isaiah exhaled, relief and apprehension swirling inside him. He hung up and looked up at the officer, who was waiting impatiently, arms crossed. "My father's going to sort this out," Isaiah said firmly. The officer rolled his eyes. "Oh, I'm sure he will," he muttered, unconvinced. One flight attendant looked at Isaiah with a puzzled expression. It was as if they'd heard variations of that line a dozen times. My father's a lawyer, my uncle's a politician, but Isaiah was no ordinary kid. His father, Lawrence Washington, was no mere lawyer or politician. He was, in fact, the largest individual shareholder in Delta Airlines, though few outside the higher echelons of the company truly understood the depth of his influence. Isaiah had never used his father's power as a trump card, but in a situation like this, when faced with blatant discrimination, it was time to pull out every resource they had. Lawrence Washington wasted no time. Within minutes, he placed a direct call to the Delta Airlines executive board. Having served on multiple committees and with considerable stock holdings, he had enough clout to demand immediate attention. The conversation was clipped and tense. "There's a situation at Gate B17 Hartsfield-Jackson. Flight to Fort Lauderdale," Lawrence said, voice seething with anger. "My son was forcibly removed from his seat without cause. I expect the highest level manager on duty to intervene immediately." The executive on the other end sounded flustered. "Mr. Washington, we take these matters very seriously. I'll have someone there in minutes." "I hope so," Lawrence bit out, "because if this is a case of racial profiling and all signs point to that, I will make sure heads roll. I'm not letting my child be treated like a criminal on a flight our family essentially helped keep in the skies." It took less than 10 minutes for a manager to sprint to Gate B17 tie askew, face glistening with sweat. He spotted Isaiah anxious, bruised, and frustrated standing by the pillar, guarded by a uniformed officer and flanked by uneasy flight attendants. The manager, Kevin Martinez, recognized Isaiah from corporate functions Lawrence Washington had organized in the past. Kevin's stomach twisted in knots. He knew how serious this could become. "Isaiah," Kevin said, approaching gently, "I'm Kevin, the operations manager. Are you all right?" Isaiah winced, rubbing his sore shoulder. "Not really. I was just trying to get home, and some passengers decided I was a threat. The flight attendants kicked me off. This officer dragged me out of my seat." Kevin looked at the officer, then at the flight attendants, his expression grim. He had a sinking feeling that an enormous storm was about to descend on Delta, one that would be entirely justified. "I see," he said, keeping his voice calm. "Let's step over here and discuss this. I promise we'll get to the bottom of it." Inside a small conference room near the gate, Isaiah, Kevin, and the officer sat down at a round table. The flight attendants hovered at the door, eyes flicking nervously between them. The older woman who had started the commotion was nowhere in sight. She had remained on the plane, presumably satisfied that her so-called threat had been removed. Kevin asked for everyone's account of what happened. The officer's version was that he had been summoned to remove a disruptive passenger based on multiple complaints. The flight attendants shrugged and mumbled about passenger safety concerns, but they offered no concrete evidence of Isaiah doing anything wrong. Isaiah recounted his story in a calm, measured tone, though it pained him to recall how the officer manhandled him. He didn't raise his voice. He let the facts speak for themselves. As Kevin listened, he felt both anger and deep embarrassment. This was exactly the kind of scenario Delta had been trying to avoid through various diversity and inclusion training initiatives. Yet here it was, a glaring example of the system failing a young black passenger who had done nothing wrong. "Isaiah, I'm so sorry this happened," Kevin said sincerely. "I promise we're going to make this right. And I assure you your father has been informed and the top executives are going to be involved." Isaiah nodded, but he felt hollow inside. As grateful as he was for Kevin's support, the damage was done. He had been publicly humiliated, labeled a threat, and dragged off a plane in front of onlookers. The sting of injustice still burned. The officer leaned forward, clearing his throat. "Look, I was just doing my job. We get a call about a potential problem passenger. We have to act. If it's a false alarm, that's not on me. I have to maintain safety." Isaiah bit back a scathing remark, recognizing that the officer was, in many ways, just a pawn. The real problem lay in the prejudice that sparked the complaint, and the flight attendants who gave it credence without verifying its legitimacy. "I understand," Kevin said to the officer politely, "but from now on I'll handle it from here. Thank you." The officer nodded and left, seemingly relieved to extricate himself from the tangled mess. While Isaiah sat in the conference room, Kevin hurried back to the plane to speak with the older woman who had instigated the entire ordeal. She sat stiffly in her seat, arms crossed, gaze darting around as if expecting to be vindicated. When Kevin approached, she seemed startled that someone in authority was speaking to her about the incident. "We had a dangerous situation," she said defensively, before Kevin could even speak. He was pacing and acting strange. "M.A.A.M. You need to understand that we've investigated this," Kevin began, keeping his voice even. "The young man was not a threat. He's actually the son of one of Delta's key stakeholders, but regardless of who he is related to, we found no evidence of wrongdoing. Do you realize the seriousness of making baseless accusations?" She flushed, her lips pressed tight. "I was only looking out for everyone's safety." "You can't be too careful these days." Kevin took a slow, measured breath. "I appreciate people being vigilant, but there is a line between vigilance and discrimination. We have training to prevent exactly this kind of incident, yet you bypassed it all with your baseless suspicion." She bristled. "Well, if you'd done your job, you wouldn't have let someone suspicious on the plane in the first place." Kevin's jaw tightened. "TSA does thorough checks. We rely on factual evidence, not racial biases. I suggest you reflect on that." Without waiting for a response, Kevin turned and left the plane. He felt a pang of satisfaction at having confronted the source of the trouble, but he also knew the damage was irreparable for Isaiah's sense of safety and dignity. Back in the conference room, Isaiah was sipping from a paper cup of water, trying to calm his nerves. Kevin re-entered, just in time to see a tall, imposing figure stride in behind him, Lawrence Washington himself. Isaiah's father was dressed in a sharp business suit, the lines of tension visible on his brow. The moment he saw his son, his expression softened, but the anger was still there like a storm barely kept at bay. "Isaiah, are you all right?" he asked, stepping forward and placing a hand gently on his son's bruised shoulder. Isaiah nodded, swallowing hard. "I'm fine, Dad," Isaiah murmured, "just humiliated." Lawrence turned to Kevin, gaze steely. "Thank you for responding quickly. I assume you have a thorough report on this?" Kevin handed Lawrence a tablet containing the incident logs, statements from the flight attendants, and a short note from the officer. "Yes, sir. I'm deeply sorry. We're conducting a full internal review. We'll provide any evidence you request." Lawrence scanned the documents with keen eyes. His jaw clenched as he read about how quickly suspicion had escalated, culminating in his son being forcibly removed from his seat. "This is unacceptable," Lawrence said quietly, though his low tone was more intimidating than shouting. "I want the employees responsible to face the consequences, and the passengers who caused this." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We can't directly control the passengers' biases, but we can address how our staff handles unfounded complaints. This was a systemic failure, Kevin. My family has invested too much in Delta to let something like this slide. This sort of incident tarnishes our reputation and, more importantly, endangers innocent people like my son. Kevin nodded. I understand, Mr. Washington. We'll ensure it never happens again. Unbeknownst to everyone in the conference room, multiple passengers had recorded the moment Isaiah was dragged down the aisle. The videos made their way to social media within minutes. By the time Lawrence finished speaking with Kevin, the story was exploding on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Hashtags like hashtag flying while black, hashtag Delta discrimination, and hashtag justice for Isaiah began trending. People were outraged that a teen had been treated like a criminal based on vague accusations. Inside Delta's PR department, phones rang off the hook. The legal team scrambled to assess potential lawsuits. Executives panicked about the stock price taking a hit. Lawrence, who had initially hoped to keep this incident in-house, realized the world was already watching, and they were on Isaiah's side. Reporters appeared at the airport within hours, clamoring for comments from Delta representatives. Some passengers who had witnessed the event were interviewed on local news, describing how upset they were to see a young black teen mistreated. The older woman's face wasn't yet known, but as the story gained traction, speculations swirled about who she was and why she had acted that way. While Delta's crisis management team scrambled, Isaiah found himself thrust into the spotlight. People recognized him in the airport's corridors. Some approached him to offer support, praising his courage for staying calm under pressure. Others recorded him on their phones, hoping to get a first-person account of what had happened. Isaiah, still shaken, felt overwhelmed. He hadn't asked for this attention. All he wanted was to go home and see his mother, to lie in his own bed and nurse his bruised shoulder in peace. But he realized that this moment had become bigger than himself. This was about every young black person who had ever been profiled, harassed, or publicly humiliated for no reason. Maybe he could turn his suffering into something positive. Maybe he could help spark real change. At a makeshift press gathering near the airport's exit, a small group of reporters cornered Isaiah and his father. Cameras flashed. Microphones were thrust in their faces. Isaiah, how did you feel when they dragged you off the plane? One reporter asked. Do you believe this was racial profiling? Asked another. Will you be taking legal action? A third inquired. Isaiah glanced at his father, who gave him a subtle nod as if to say, "Speak your truth." Clearing his throat, Isaiah tried to project confidence. I was afraid, he admitted, voice trembling at first. More than that, I was embarrassed. I did nothing wrong just sitting in my seat. But some people saw me as a threat because of who I am. Yes, I believe race played a big part, and I think that's something we need to address, not just with Delta, but in our entire society. He took a breath. As for legal action, that's up to my parents and our lawyers. But I do hope Delta will stand up and take real responsibility. I want everyone, no matter their race, to feel safe and respected when they travel. Right now, that's not always the case. Lawrence stepped in. I'm Lawrence Washington, Isaiah's father. I've been involved with Delta Airlines for many years, but right now I'm speaking as a father first. My son was mistreated in a horrifying way. We are absolutely pursuing an internal investigation and appropriate legal avenues. Delta's leadership has assured me they will fully cooperate. The only way forward is to confront this bias head-on and ensure that such a travesty never happens to another passenger, black, brown, or otherwise. His voice carried the firm command of someone used to boardroom negotiations, but also the raw emotion of a parent who had seen his child hurt. The reporters continued firing questions, but Lawrence gently guided Isaiah away, saying, "That's enough for now. My son needs rest." As the day wore on, social media fury boiled over into real-world consequences. Protesters gathered outside the Delta ticket counters with signs like "Racial profiling ends, now and justice for Isaiah." Other passengers threatened boycotts, some cancelling their flights with Delta and posting pictures of their cancelled itineraries. One particularly scathing viral tweet read, "If Delta can't protect a teenager who's just sitting quietly, how can any of us trust them to protect us from real threats?" Within Delta's corporate HQ in Atlanta, emergency meetings were convened. Some senior staff demanded the immediate firing of the flight attendants involved, though their union representation complicated matters. Meanwhile, the officer who had dragged Isaiah off the plane found himself under internal investigation by airport security management. The older woman who had started the entire incident was not publicly identified yet, but rumors flew that she was some local politician's wife or perhaps an unassuming housewife with a fear of flying. In any case, her part in the fiasco loomed over the narrative, fueling outrage. Lawrence sat in on these meetings, wearing two hats, a major stakeholder in the airline and the father of the victim. He insisted on radical measures, mandatory retraining for all Delta employees on handling passenger complaints, an overhaul of how potential threats are assessed, and public accountability from Delta in the form of statements and visible community outreach. Some executives balked, worried about the cost and the public relations hit. But with the video evidence so damning, and the threat of losing one of their most influential stakeholders, they had little choice but to comply. That's when Lawrence dropped another bombshell. "If you think this story ends with a quick apology and some hush money, you're sorely mistaken," he said coldly. "This is a systemic problem, and the system must change." While Delta scrambled to do damage control, an unlikely twist emerged. The older woman who had falsely accused Isaiah was revealed through a passenger's viral TikTok. In that video, she could be heard stating her name, Nancy Albright, when the flight attendant asked who had raised the complaint. The internet quickly dug into any publicly available records and found that Nancy Albright was part of several local community organizations in Atlanta, ironically including one that promoted unity and racial harmony. Naturally, the revelation sparked new waves of outrage. Comment sections lit up with condemnation. Nancy Albright went silent on social media, shutting down her accounts. Journalists knocked on her door asking for an explanation. She refused to speak to anyone. Some speculated she was hiding, others guessed she might be seeking legal advice. It didn't end there. A community group she belonged to, Atlanta for Unity, released a statement distancing itself from her actions, declaring that her conduct was antithetical to everything we stand for. They vowed to remove her from their membership if her involvement was confirmed. Her world was beginning to crumble, a direct backlash of karma for the harm she'd caused. Through all the public frenzy, Isaiah battled his own emotional turmoil. Part of him was proud to stand against injustice. Another part was exhausted by the attention, the interviews, the constant rehashing of the humiliating incident. He felt guilty that his father, a busy man, had to invest so much time dealing with this crisis instead of focusing on the airline's future. Even more, he felt uneasy about being a symbol for a cause he'd never planned to represent. He returned home to his mother, who embraced him tightly and kissed his bruised shoulder. They shared a late-night conversation over cups of chamomile tea. "I know it's hard," his mother, Lydia, said softly, stroking his hair, "but sometimes we don't choose the battles that define us. They find us." Isaiah's eyes brimmed with tears. "I hate that this happened. I hate that so many others have gone through similar or worse situations. I feel powerless, even though everyone's treating me like a hero." Lydia's face reflected compassion. "Your father and I raised you to be compassionate and courageous. You have a voice, and the world is listening to it now. Let them hear your truth." Days after the incident, Delta's CEO held a press conference. Cameras clicked as he addressed the public. "I want to start by apologizing to Isaiah Washington and his family," the CEO began, clearly rattled. "What happened was wrong and does not reflect Delta's values. We have initiated an internal overhaul of our policies to ensure that no passenger is ever again subjected to such treatment without a clear, factual basis. We will work closely with Mr. Washington and his family to develop better training protocols and safeguard the dignity of every traveler." The apology was a step in the right direction, and many commended Delta for confronting the issue instead of denying or deflecting. Yet the public demanded more. They wanted accountability for the flight attendants, for the officer, for the entire structure that allowed prejudice to run unchecked. Soon after, Delta announced a sweeping plan: mandatory sensitivity and conflict de-escalation training for all employees, stricter guidelines on responding to passenger complaints, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. The plan also included a new role, a Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, with the power to implement real changes across the organization. Meanwhile, Nancy Albright faced a reckoning of her own. Her name had become synonymous with bigotry in local news stories. Her neighbors began to avoid her, refusing to make eye contact. The organizations she once volunteered for disinvited her from events or quietly removed her from their rosters. She lost her seat on the board of a community initiative that prided itself on bridging racial divides. Anonymous messages appeared in her mailbox, some scolding her, others threatening her safety. Acts Isaiah and his family did not condone, but could not control. She tried to make a statement on social media, claiming she was simply concerned for everyone's safety and had never intended to cause a racial incident. But the internet was unforgiving. The widely circulated footage of her frantic accusations on the plane belied any claim of innocence. One day, as she left her suburban home to buy groceries, a local news reporter ambushed her in the driveway. "Miss Albright, what do you have to say about the alleged racial profiling of Isaiah Washington?" the reporter asked, thrusting a microphone in her face. Nancy's eyes darted wildly, her voice trembling with defensive anger. "I did nothing wrong. I was afraid. If you think that's a crime, then maybe you should talk to TSA for letting people like him on planes." Her words only made things worse. The clip of her yelling people like him became yet another viral sensation, sealing her fate in the court of public opinion. The small online movement that had initially tried to defend her evaporated. She was now the poster face of prejudice, and the ramifications were severe. She lost friends, community standing, and many argued that she had only herself to blame. While Nancy faced her own downfall, Isaiah began receiving an outpouring of support from civil rights organizations, local churches, and community leaders. He was invited to speak at a youth conference about racial profiling, though he felt hesitant to thrust himself further into the spotlight. It was his father, Lawrence, who encouraged him to accept. "You have a platform," Lawrence told him. "Use it for good. We can't let this moment slip away without making progress." So Isaiah agreed. On a mild Saturday afternoon in a local community center, he stood on a modest stage in front of a crowd of a few hundred young people. He shared his story, detailing how quickly prejudice could turn an ordinary moment into a life-changing ordeal. He emphasized the power of compassion and the importance of standing up for oneself and others. Applause echoed in the small auditorium as he finished. For the first time since the incident, Isaiah felt a sense of empowerment. His pain was shaping into purpose. Though Delta had apologized publicly, the Washington family still filed a formal complaint against the airline and the airport police for the unlawful removal and use of force. Some questioned whether the Washingtons were going too far, given their close ties to Delta, but Lawrence remained resolute. If it were any other family, they'd likely sue without hesitation. We're doing this to set a precedent, to force real change, and to publicly acknowledge wrongdoing. During preliminary hearings, the officer who dragged Isaiah off the plane testified that he was acting on direct orders from the flight attendants, who claimed Isaiah was threatening. The flight attendants tried to defend themselves by citing passengers' complaints. The older woman, Nancy Albright, was subpoenaed as a witness. Despite attempts to avoid appearing, she eventually took the stand, looking haggard and defeated. She recounted her version, painting herself as a concerned passenger terrified by unpredictable behavior. But under the scrutiny of lawyers, her story fell apart. She admitted that Isaiah had not spoken or threatened anyone, nor had she seen any actual suspicious items. It was a gut feeling, she said, and she insisted it had nothing to do with race. The cross-examination by the Washington family's attorney was brutal. You claim it wasn't about race, yet you specifically singled out a black teenager in a hoodie doing absolutely nothing suspicious. Why didn't you alert the staff about any other passenger? Nancy couldn't answer coherently, stumbling over her own justifications. The court of public opinion and likely the legal system had little sympathy left for her. After the hearings, news channels broadcasted her contradictory testimony, further cementing her downfall. A few weeks later, after media attention had calmed somewhat, Isaiah had to travel again, this time for a speaking engagement at a youth leadership conference in Washington, D.C. He was anxious. Memories of being dragged off the plane still haunted him, but he refused to let fear win. This time, Delta Airlines assigned a special liaison, Maria Rodriguez, to accompany him through check-in and boarding. Maria was part of the newly formed passenger advocacy team. She greeted Isaiah warmly at the airport. "I'm here to make sure everything goes smoothly," she said, offering a genuine smile. The difference was night and day. When Isaiah approached the gate, the staff welcomed him with respect and courtesy, exactly how any passenger should be treated. Some even recognized him and offered quiet words of solidarity. He took his seat without issue. No accusatory glances, no hostile whispers. The flight departed on time, and Isaiah breathed a sigh of relief as the plane lifted into the sky. Halfway through the flight, the captain made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to extend a special welcome to Isaiah Washington on board today. Isaiah, we commend your bravery in sharing your story and helping us improve. We're committed to a future where all passengers are treated with dignity and respect." A smattering of applause spread throughout the cabin. Isaiah felt his cheeks heat with a mixture of pride and embarrassment. It was a surreal moment, a far cry from being hauled out in handcuffs. He glanced at the flight attendants, who smiled reassuringly. It wasn't perfect. There was still a long road ahead for Delta and for society, but it was a step toward healing. In the months following the incident, Nancy Albright's life continued to unravel. She resigned from the last community board she was on, citing health reasons. Her husband, who worked for a prominent law firm, faced scrutiny from colleagues who disapproved of Nancy's actions and the negative attention it brought. Tensions rose at home, and eventually they sold their house to move to another state. The opportunity for Nancy to rebuild her life far from the scandal was her last refuge from the incessant criticism and social isolation. Meanwhile, the flight attendants involved were suspended pending completion of the internal review. One eventually resigned, citing emotional distress from the backlash. Another faced mandatory counseling and a final warning on their record. The airline implemented the promised changes, rolling out intensive training modules on empathy, unconscious bias, and proper threat assessment across all staff levels. Compliance was enforced rigorously, with employees required to pass new evaluations or risk suspension. Delta's stock dipped initially but recovered as the company publicly embraced a new era of accountability. Lawrence maintained his influence, ensuring that the changes promised were not just lip service. By the time Isaiah turned 18, he had become something of a youth leader, invited to speak at schools and community forums about overcoming adversity, confronting discrimination, and channeling anger into activism. Though he missed the relative anonymity of his old life, he found purpose in sharing his story. His bruise had long healed, but the memory of that traumatic flight lingered, fueling his drive to advocate for change. He balanced his newfound advocacy with the demands of typical teenage life, final exams, college applications, friendships, and even dating. Sometimes he yearned for normalcy, to just be a regular kid without the weight of a public persona. But whenever that exhaustion crept in, he remembered the letters and emails he'd received from other young people who faced prejudice. They thanked him, said his story gave them hope. That made it worthwhile. On a crisp winter evening, Isaiah and Lawrence sat on the back porch of their home. They gazed up at the stars, sipping hot cocoa. Isaiah spoke first, voice gentle. "Dad, I never really thanked you for everything. You came to my rescue that day, and you've supported me in every way since." Lawrence smiled, placing a hand on Isaiah's shoulder. "I'm proud of you. You stood up for yourself with dignity, and now you're helping others stand up too." He paused, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "When I invested in Delta years ago, I never imagined we'd be at the center of such a storm. But sometimes life puts you where you need to be. You became the catalyst for a change we've needed for a long time." Isaiah nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, it still hurts that it happened. But maybe that's how change is born, through pain that refuses to be silent." They sat quietly for a while, the night sky a silent witness to their bond. Their relationship had grown deeper through the adversity, forged by shared anger and determination to right a wrong. Lawrence had taught Isaiah about perseverance, and Isaiah had taught his father about the power of youth, honesty, and vulnerability. In the year following the incident, Delta's new policies began to bear fruit. Complaints about discriminatory treatment dropped significantly. Passengers reported feeling safer and more respected. The media praised the airline for taking swift and public measures to address the scandal, turning a shameful moment into a blueprint for reform. Other airlines took notice, adopting similar measures to train their staff against racial profiling and unnecessary escalations. Isaiah's case became a case study in corporate ethics classes. Professors highlighted it as an example of how a massive corporation could stumble and, with enough pressure, pivot toward more equitable practices. Delta's new Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer even personally thanked Isaiah at an employee summit, calling him a catalyst for positive transformation. Time passed, and the fervor around Isaiah's story gradually settled into history. But for Isaiah, it was a defining chapter of his adolescence. He had learned firsthand how fragile justice could be when fear and prejudice took hold, and how crucial it was to stand up, even when standing up felt risky or impossible. Whenever he flew, which was quite often due to his father's position and his new speaking engagements, he still felt a slight pinch of anxiety during boarding. But the more he flew, the more he reclaimed that space, a seat in the sky that belonged to him just as much as anyone else. He stayed in touch with Kevin Martinez, the operations manager who had intervened on his behalf that fateful day. Kevin provided periodic updates on the airline's progress, letting Isaiah know how the reforms were rolling out. The flight attendants who remained at Delta, now better trained, showed a renewed sense of empathy and caution in how they handled passenger complaints. The entire culture began to shift, slowly but measurably. Isaiah's story reached far beyond an airplane aisle. It touched on universal themes: the crushing pain of prejudice, the importance of family support, the responsibility of corporate entities to protect their consumers, and the resilience of one teenager who refused to be silently victimized. Hard karma found its targets. Nancy Albright faced public shame and personal downfall, a stark example of the power of accountability. The flight attendants and airport officer faced disciplinary measures, forcing them to confront their biases and their responsibilities. Delta, once faltering under scandal, emerged with stronger policies and a more inclusive spirit. And Isaiah, though wounded, healed into someone more compassionate and determined. What began as a horrifying ordeal became a turning point for an entire industry. Yes, prejudice still existed, and yes, there would be more battles ahead. But for Isaiah and his father, the knowledge that they had sparked change in one of the biggest airlines in the world was a testament to how a single voice and a single act of courage could alter the course of countless lives. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey of Isaiah Washington, his unfair removal from a flight, the incredible twist of revealing his father's influence in the airline, and the wave of reform sparked by his painful experience. This story highlights how quickly prejudice can transform an everyday moment into a life-changing ordeal, but also how a single stand for justice can create waves of change. Isaiah and his family confronted the injustice head-on, proving that resilience, unity, and unwavering determination can shatter even the strongest walls of bias. If you found this story inspiring or thought-provoking, please take a moment to like this video, share it with friends and family, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that shine a light on injustice and the incredible power of compassion and courage. Your support helps us continue sharing messages that matter. Thank you for watching.